The marble floors of the Ritz Carlton lobby gleamed like mirrors under the crystal chandeliers, but the atmosphere was thick with tension, as hotel guests gave wide berth to the man in the $1,000 suit, who sat alone at the center table, his dark eyes blazing with barely contained fury. No staff member or guest dared to approach Farid Al Rashid, whose reputation for explosive temper and ruthless business practices had created an invisible barrier of fear around his table, until 7-year-old Jamal Williams appeared at his elbow with a crumpled bag of gummy bears and an innocent smile. "Excuse me, mister, you look really sad," the boy said softly, offering his most precious possession to a stranger whose wealth commanded respect, but whose volatile personality inspired terror. "My grandma always told me that candy makes everything a little bit better. Would you like some gummy bears?" What neither the watching hotel staff nor the wealthy Arab millionaire himself could have imagined was that this simple act of childhood generosity from a gardener's son would shatter decades of emotional barriers and transform one of the most feared businessmen in the world into someone capable of rediscovering his own humanity. The child had been exploring the luxurious hotel, while his father Marcus worked in the meticulously maintained gardens outside, trimming hedges and planting flowers with the quiet dignity of someone who took pride in his craft. Despite the condescending treatment he often received from wealthy guests, who saw landscaping as menial labor, performed by invisible people, Marcus had brought Jamal to work because the boys' school was closed for a teacher planning day, and the hotel management had reluctantly agreed to let the child remain on the grounds as long as he stayed out of sight and caused no disturbance to the prestigious clientele who paid premium rates for an experience unmarred by reminders of the working-class people who maintained their comfort. Farid's business empire was built on luxury hotel developments across the Middle East and Europe, but his expansion into the American market had been plagued by regulatory challenges, cultural misunderstandings, and a series of partnerships that had ended in bitter legal disputes when his autocratic management style clashed with local business practices. The meeting he had been waiting for was supposed to finalize a joint venture that would give him access to prime real estate in Manhattan, but his reputation for treating subordinates and business partners like servants had apparently reached his potential American collaborators, who had decided that no amount of money was worth dealing with someone whose arrogance and contempt for others made successful collaboration impossible. The hotel staff had been briefed about Farid's temperament by colleagues who had dealt with him during previous visits, and everyone from the concierge to the cleaning crew had developed strategies for avoiding unnecessary interaction with a guest whose dissatisfaction could result in screaming tirades, threats of lawsuits, and demands that employees be fired for imaginary slights. The general manager had issued specific instructions that Mr. Al Rashid should be accommodated in every possible way, while minimizing direct contact that might trigger his unpredictable fury. Jamal had been fascinated by the hotel's opulent interior since arriving that morning, marveling at the elaborate flower arrangements, the uniformed staff, and the elegant guests who moved through the space with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about whether they belonged in such surroundings. His father had warned him to stay quiet and invisible, but the natural curiosity and friendliness of childhood had proven stronger than caution as he explored the public areas and observed the adult world of luxury and privilege that existed so far from his own experience in the modest apartment he shared with his father. The boy had noticed the angry man sitting alone long before approaching him, watching from behind marble columns as hotel employees hurried past without making eye contact, and other guests chose seats far from the table, where Farid waited with increasing agitation. Jamal's 7-year-old mind couldn't understand why everyone seemed afraid of someone who just looked sad and lonely, and his grandmother's lessons about sharing treats with people who seemed unhappy had overridden any instinct for self-preservation that might have warned him away from someone whose body language screamed danger. The offer was accompanied by the presentation of a small bag of multicolored candy that had clearly been opened and sampled, but which represented the boy's most precious possession and his willingness to share it with a stranger who seemed to need cheering up. The gesture was so unexpected and genuine that it cut through Farid's anger like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, leaving him momentarily speechless as he tried to process the fact that a child was offering him comfort when every adult in the vicinity was treating him like a dangerous animal to be avoided. Farid's first instinct was irritation at being approached by someone's unsupervised child, but something about the boy's earnest expression and generous offer penetrated the defensive barriers that he had built around his emotions after years of business betrayals and personal disappointments. No one had offered him kindness without expecting something in return for longer than he could remember, and the simple gift of candy, from someone who clearly possessed very little, created a moment of vulnerability that he hadn't experienced since childhood. "Where are your parents?" Farid asked, his voice carrying less hostility than anyone who knew him might have expected, though his tone was still sharp with the authority of someone accustomed to immediate answers to his questions. "My dad is working outside in the gardens," Jamal replied, without any of the nervousness that adults displayed when Farid questioned them, his natural honesty preventing him from recognizing that he might be getting his father in trouble by admitting to wandering the hotel unsupervised. "He's really good at making flowers grow and making everything look pretty. Are you sure you don't want any candy? These red ones taste like strawberries." The child's persistence in offering treats, despite Farid's obvious reluctance to engage, demonstrated the kind of stubborn generosity that hadn't yet been worn down by repeated rejection or social expectations about maintaining appropriate boundaries with strangers. His focus on sharing something that brought him joy revealed an emotional intelligence that most adults had lost in their pursuit of success and self-protection. Hotel staff members, who had been watching the interaction from a safe distance, held their breath as they waited to see how Farid would respond to the child's approach, because his reactions to unexpected situations were notoriously unpredictable and often explosive. The general manager was already calculating the potential lawsuit and public relations disaster that might result from an altercation between a wealthy guest and an employee's child, while security guards positioned themselves to intervene if the situation escalated beyond verbal confrontation. But instead of the expected outburst, Farid found himself accepting a red gummy bear from the boy's outstretched hand, more out of surprise than hunger, and discovering that the simple act of receiving a gift from someone who expected nothing in return had awakened feelings that he had buried under years of cynicism and defensive anger. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice carrying a gentleness that his business associates would not have recognized, because Jamal's innocent generosity had reminded him of his own childhood in Damascus, when his grandmother had shared sweets with him during the long afternoons when his parents were busy building the business empire that would eventually consume their attention completely. "You're welcome," Jamal replied with a smile that lit up his entire face, clearly delighted that his offer of friendship had been accepted by someone who had seemed so lonely and unapproachable. "My name is Jamal. What's your name?" The direct question, asked with such natural friendliness, forced Farid to confront how long it had been since anyone had approached him as a person rather than as a business opportunity or obstacle to be navigated carefully. His wealth and reputation had created a barrier between himself and genuine human connection that he had barely noticed until this moment, when a child's curiosity had penetrated his isolation. "My name is Farid," he replied, finding himself drawn into conversation with someone whose motives were completely transparent and whose interest in him had nothing to do with money or advantage. "How old are you, Jamal?" "I'm 7, and I just lost my first tooth last week," Jamal announced proudly, opening his mouth to demonstrate the gap where his front tooth had been. "The tooth fairy gave me $5, which is the most money I've ever had all at once. Do you want to see my tooth fairy money?" The enthusiastic offer to share his greatest treasure with a complete stranger demonstrated the kind of trust and openness that Farid had forgotten existed in the world, because his adult experience had taught him that everyone wanted something from him and that generosity was always calculated rather than spontaneous. As their conversation continued, other hotel guests began to take notice of the unprecedented scene unfolding in the lobby, because the transformation in Farid's demeanor was so dramatic that people who had been avoiding his table out of fear now found themselves curious about what could have caused such a change in someone whose reputation for hostility was well established among the luxury hotel circuit. "My dad says that sharing makes good things better and bad things not so bad," Jamal continued, his 7-year-old philosophy delivered with the confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be improved through kindness and generosity. "Is something bad happening to you today? Maybe sharing my candy will help make it better. The innocent question about whether something bad was happening forced Farid to confront the reality that his anger and isolation were visible even to a child, and that his wealth and success had not protected him from the kind of emotional pain that a 7-year-old could recognize and want to heal through simple acts of friendship. The failed business meeting that had triggered his current fury suddenly seemed less important than the realization that he had become the type of person that others feared and avoided. Someone whose presence made rooms feel dangerous rather than welcoming, whose success had been built on intimidation rather than inspiration. Yes, something disappointing happened today, Farid admitted, his honesty surprising him because he rarely acknowledged vulnerability or failure to anyone, let alone a child he had just met. I was supposed to meet some people who decided they didn't want to work with me, and that made me very angry. That sounds really mean, Jamal said with the indignation that children feel when confronted with obvious unfairness. My dad always says that people who break promises are not being very nice, and that you shouldn't feel bad about yourself when other people don't keep their word. The simple wisdom about not internalizing other people's bad behavior provided Farid with a perspective that his expensive business consultants and legal advisors had never offered, because Jamal's insight came from genuine care rather than professional obligation to say whatever the client wanted to hear. Over the next hour, their conversation deepened as Jamal shared stories about his life with his father, his school friends, and his dreams of becoming a scientist who would invent machines to help people solve their problems. His natural curiosity and optimism provided a stark contrast to the cynicism and suspicion that had characterized Farid's interactions with adults for years. Do you have any kids? Jamal asked, with the directness that children use when they want to understand the adult world around them. The question struck Farid with unexpected pain because it forced him to confront one of his greatest regrets and sources of loneliness. I have a son who lives far away with his mother, he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of relationships damaged by his pursuit of business success at the expense of family connections. Why don't you live with them? Jamal asked, his innocent curiosity opening wounds that Farid had spent years trying to ignore through work and the accumulation of ever greater wealth. The honest answer would have required Farid to admit that his marriage had failed because he had prioritized business deals over family time, that his son barely knew him because he had missed countless school events and family occasions for meetings and negotiations, and that his wife had eventually decided that raising their child alone was better than staying married to someone who was physically present but emotionally absent. I made some mistakes that hurt the people I love most, Farid said finally, his admission carrying the kind of vulnerability that he had never shown to business associates or even close friends. I thought that making lots of money was more important than spending time with my family, and by the time I realized how wrong I was, they had decided they were better off without me. The confession of failure as a husband and father created a moment of silence between them. But instead of the judgment or pity that Farid might have expected from an adult, Jamal responded with the kind of practical optimism that children bring to seemingly impossible problems. Maybe you could call them and say you're sorry, Jamal suggested, with the confidence of someone who believed that most problems could be solved through honest communication and genuine remorse. My dad says that saying sorry doesn't always fix everything, but it's usually the best place to start when you've hurt someone you care about. The simple advice about apologizing as the first step toward healing damaged relationships was something that Farid's pride had prevented him from considering, because admitting fault and expressing vulnerability felt dangerous to someone whose business success had depended on projecting strength and infallibility at all times. Marcus Williams had been working in the hotel gardens for 2 hours when he realized that he hadn't seen his son for longer than usual, and his growing concern about Jamal's whereabouts sent him searching through the areas where children might explore while their parents worked. The discovery that his 7-year-old was sitting in the lobby, engaged in animated conversation with one of the hotel's most feared guests, sent waves of panic through his system, because he knew that Farid Al Rashid's reputation for explosive anger could spell disaster for both his job and his child's safety. Jamal, come here right now, Marcus called from the lobby entrance, his voice carrying the urgent authority that parents use when their children are in potential danger. Though he tried to keep his tone respectful enough to avoid offending the wealthy guest, who might have the power to get him fired or worse. "Dad, I want you to meet my new friend, Farid," Jamal announced happily. Oblivious to the tension radiating from his father and the nervous attention they were receiving from hotel staff, who had gathered to witness what might become a catastrophic confrontation between an employee and a notoriously difficult guest. Marcus approached the table with the kind of careful deference that working-class people learn to display when dealing with wealthy customers, who could destroy their livelihoods with a single complaint, his entire body language communicating apology and submission as he prepared to extract his son from a situation that could end very badly for both of them. "Mr. Al Rashid, I apologize profusely for my son bothering you," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the strain of someone who depended on his job to support his child and couldn't afford to offend someone with the power to have him terminated immediately. "Jamal, we need to go back outside right now and let this gentleman return to his business." The interaction between Marcus and his son provided Farid with insight into a relationship built on love, respect, and mutual care that stood in sharp contrast to his own family dynamics, where wealth had created distance rather than closeness, and where business concerns always took precedence over emotional connection. "Actually, your son hasn't been bothering me at all," Farid said, his tone carrying none of the hostility that Marcus had feared, because Jamal's friendship had reminded him of values and priorities that he had abandoned in his pursuit of ever greater wealth and power. "He's been sharing his candy with me and keeping me company during a difficult afternoon. You should be proud to have raised such a generous and thoughtful child." The unexpected praise from someone whose approval could mean the difference between employment and unemployment sent waves of relief through Marcus, but also confusion about why a man known for treating working-class people with contempt was speaking so warmly about his son. "Jamal has always been friendly with everyone," Marcus replied carefully, still uncertain about whether this positive interaction would continue or suddenly shift into the kind of confrontation that could destroy his career and his family's financial security. "He told me that you work in the gardens," Farid continued, his interest in Marcus's work surprising both the gardener and the hotel staff who were watching the interaction with fascination. "The landscaping here is exceptional. You clearly take great pride in your craft." The compliment about his professional skills was so unexpected that Marcus wasn't sure how to respond, because wealthy guests rarely acknowledged the work of maintenance staff, let alone praised their expertise and dedication. As the three of them continued to talk, Farid found himself learning about Marcus's background as a single father who worked multiple jobs to support his son's education and dreams, and about Jamal's academic achievements and aspirations that far exceeded what his family's economic circumstances might have suggested were possible. The conversation revealed a family whose love and mutual support had created richness of relationship that contrasted sharply with Farid's own isolation despite his material wealth, and it forced him to confront questions about what constituted true success and meaningful existence. "Jamal mentioned that you're interested in science," Farid said to the boy, his voice carrying genuine curiosity, rather than the condescending tone that wealthy adults often used when talking to children from working-class families. "I want to invent things that help people solve problems," Jamal replied enthusiastically, his eyes lighting up as he described his dreams of becoming an engineer or scientist. "My dad says that the best jobs are the ones where you get to make other people's lives better." The philosophy about meaningful work as service to others was another lesson that Farid had forgotten during his climb to wealth and power, and hearing it expressed with such clarity by a 7-year-old reminded him of his own youthful idealism before cynicism and greed had corrupted his motivations. Over the following weeks, Farid found himself returning to the hotel not for business meetings but to visit with Jamal and Marcus, drawn by the authentic human connection that he had been missing for years. The friendship that began with a shared bag of gummy bears evolved into something deeper and more meaningful than any of his professional relationships. Through his relationship with the Williams family, Farid began to understand that his wealth could be a tool for creating positive change rather than simply accumulating more possessions and power. He established a scholarship fund for children from working-class families who showed academic promise, started mentoring programs that connected successful business people with young students, and began using his resources to support community projects that improved life for ordinary people rather than just enhancing luxury amenities for the wealthy. Most importantly, Jamal's innocent question about calling his family to apologize had planted seeds that eventually grew into Farid's decision to reach out to his estranged wife and son. The conversation was difficult and painful, but it began a slow process of rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by years of neglect and misplaced priorities. The transformation in Farid's character and business practices became legendary within the luxury hotel industry, where his reputation shifted from fear-inspiring tyrant to respected leader who treated employees and partners with dignity and fairness. The change had begun with a 7-year-old's offer of candy, but it had grown into a complete reimagining of what success meant and how wealth should be used. Years later, when Jamal graduated from college with a degree in engineering, Farid was there to celebrate alongside Marcus, having become not just a benefactor, but a genuine member of their chosen family. The bond that had been forged through shared gummy bears had evolved into something that money could never buy: authentic love, mutual respect, and the deep satisfaction that comes from relationships based on character rather than calculation. The boy who had dared to approach a feared millionaire with nothing but candy and kindness had accomplished what armies of business advisors, therapists, and consultants had failed to achieve. He had reminded a successful but lonely man that true wealth was measured by the quality of relationships rather than the quantity of possessions, and that the most important transformations often began with the smallest acts of generosity from the most unexpected sources. The marble lobby of the Ritz Carlton had witnessed many powerful business deals over the years, but none more transformative than the moment when a child's innocent offer of gummy bears had melted the heart of a man who had forgotten how to receive love without suspicion and give kindness without calculation. In that exchange, both had discovered that the most valuable currency in the world was not money or power, but the simple human capacity for connection, compassion, and the courage to be vulnerable with strangers who might become family.